Okay, so we are starting chapter two. Um, just FYI, Chase has suggested a few changes to the reading schedule so that we break at more thematically reasonable places. I just broke things up purely in terms of page numbers. So it doesn't affect the next couple of weeks. So actually, it won't make any differences until March 18th. And so what I'll do is I'll revise the full reading schedule according to Chase's recommendations and then repost that. Um, but again, it won't bother us. It won't change anything for the next few weeks. So unless you're way far ahead, it should not be a problem. Um, so today we start talking about being in the world. And as always, I'm happy to start where anybody has a place to start. If you have a particular question or a particularly interesting idea or something you want to reflect on with the rest of us, please speak up. Nobody has anything. I'll say something here shortly, but I'm happy to let anyone begin.
I'm curious what you would like to begin because I thought it would be interesting to start on 57 where he particularly said that Dasein ontologically understood as care. I thought that was a fascinating concept and wanted to get everyone's opinion and maybe elucidate a bit more on it because this particular section has so many different parts. So it seems like he wants to establish epistemic certainty, but at the same time be able to express Dasein in a way that's unique to you. And I thought it was really interesting that he labeled it ontologically is care. So how was that understood or read by the group?
So I'll let Deirdre and or Chase or someone who knows Heidegger better confirm or disconfirm this, but uh, he what he tends to do as a general rule is he will introduce something very briefly, and then he'll expand on it a great deal later in the book. And I think care is one of those things. He just kind of mentions it here, and then later on he's going to go into great detail. So, and I haven't read. It's been many years since I've read this book, and so I can't remember what he says there. So, and I haven't read ahead this time. So all I know about care is what he says here, but I think all we have is a very preliminary, not even a sketch here. He just kind of mentions it, but he'll go into much greater detail later, I believe.
And it's quite a long build-up. There's a lot of components to it that he's not mentioning. The whole springing ahead and all of that is yet to be even hinted at.
Yeah, care is the kind of the unified structure that he's getting, this existential structure that he's getting at. Hair is kind of the unifying phenomena of that. So it has, like being in the world, it has these component parts, but it's still one whole thing with say, qualitative multiplicity, I guess. Yeah, but he'll expand on the care stuff quite a bit. And that's one of the things that I think the English translation, you have to take that with a grain of salt and really see it more as something, a completely different concept than anything to do with the English word care. I know you can see eventually why he uses that word or why the translators use that word, but I think at first it's good to see it as almost at a completely blank slate. Um, yeah, but you'll see it as a whole bunch of these different components, which is also one of the places where I know the newer translation is going to diverge from the other one quite a bit on all these different components of care, and some of them even I think there's even some that they will use the same word, the translation between the translations for different things. So it gets
Oh, no.
confusing. Um, which is
The word
why
being
also
used
we
here
should
for
refer
oh,
to
sorry.
uh the the pages that we refer to. We need to use the German numbering, which is the on the side there.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned this to Shriek when we first were introducing ourselves, but we're using two different translations. So some people are using the translation you're using, some people are using another translation. But if you look in the margin, there's these numbers, and those refer to page numbers in a early German text. And so if we refer to those marginal numbers, then we should both be able to find it. But part of the interesting, I guess part of what's going to be interesting here is, like Chase said, the different choices these translators made.
That
Because
using the marginal numbering, I think that's standard, if not traditional, to do that because I've got a German edition of the book
Oh,
and it matches up exactly. And I think there's so many people who are real Heidegger scholars um are good enough in German that they can just read through it in German. So you have to be able to reference those numbers. Most people just write a capital H followed by the German numbering to reference what page they're on. And the what Chase mentioned about the word here, it's Versorge, which is more like welfare than the kind of care that you might immediately think in English when you hear the word care. Wouldn't you agree, Chase?
well, I'd be curious. It's like it wasn't elucidated on, but the end of this section on 59, he seems to say that this is the last part of page 59 in the Standby. Because knowing has been given this priority, our understanding of its on onmost kind of being is led astray, and thus being in the world must be delineated more precisely with reference to knowing the world, and must itself be made visible as an existential modality of being in. So is he hinting that care is kind of an existential modality of being in the world? Because he seems to be criticizing the phenomenological I guess tradition in the fact that all human activity is conceptual activity and can be labeled as conceptual activity with the right phenomenology. And he seems to hint at the end of this section that care, which is probably a really bad translation, as you mentioned, is a form of existential modality of being in the world. Is that close to what it is, or am I way off base?
I think he's saying being in the world is an existential modality of being in, isn't he?
Okay.
What he's saying there is that is a knowing the world is a existential modality of being in.
Okay, so
What he's
more
trying to
knowing.
do is kind of reverse I think this is what one of the main points Heidegger makes is okay. So from especially Descartes onward, you've got a kind of a primacy given to epistemology as the starting point, cogito ergo sum. And what he's trying to do is show that that's actually not primary or foundational, and in fact, it's a mode or a modification of something more primordial, which is being in the world. So being in the world is kind of that's the ontological existential structure of Dasein. I just realized that statement itself would mean absolutely nothing to somebody who doesn't know Heideggerian jargon. But hopefully we've learned enough by now that that made sense.
Well, what
So
I
that's what
think,
being in the world is, and then knowing is this kind of uh, deficient mode or modification of it that arises in special circumstances. So he's just reversing the primacy between those.
like what
Real quick, I was going to push back on. I don't think this is a distinctly Heideggerian innovation here. I think I said it last week. From Kant through the idealists, I think you can include Kierkegaard, certainly Marx. There's a primacy to practical reason over theoretical reason, right? In the Kantian system, we start with a critique of pure reason, but then we move to a critique of practical reason and the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. And then the third critique is supposed to be a kind of adjudication between the two of them, which many regard as a failure. But Kant insists reason is one. It has a theoretical mode and a practical mode. And then he says, if one of these is given priority, it's the practical mode of reason, which is given priority over the theoretical mode. So
But I got some of the passage in here, I got the sense that Heidegger was going exactly the opposite direction. So this is on Heidegger 59, which is also Stambaugh 59, the paragraph right before section 13. Thus, the phenomenon of being in has, for the most part, been represented exclusively by a single exemplar, knowing the world. This has not only been the case in epistemology, for even practical behavior has been understood as behavior which is not theoretical and atheoretical. And so what I took him to be saying there is actually practical activity is also founded on being in the world. So that,
Right.
and there was another passage where he said something similar to that, because being in the world, I don't think is primarily practical activity. I think it's a certain kind of engagement with the world, but it's not, I don't think it's practical in the sense of this is how we do things in the world. This is how we complete tasks and achieve goals. And it's not, I don't think, I mean, I could be wrong, but that's the impression.
I think that I'm not sure that I agree with either of you. No? I'm not sure. I think that I think you're partially right, Nevitt, that he is saying that that this understanding it as non-theoretical and atheoretical has led us astray, if you follow through that to the next sentence, right? But right. But what he's saying there is that being in the world is and I think I'm not sure I agree, Chase, with the way you read it. I think being in the world is a modality of being in, from the way that sentence reads to me, at least in the I pull the German and see if I can parse it out better in there, but I'm not sure my German is good enough. And I think that's important, because being in the world isn't something I think you can quite get at this point in the text by trying to understand it within the context of that sentence. I think he's really setting it up like Chase said, as different from the historical philosophical concept of things, but he's not making a meaningful attempt. I think he's trying to. He's doing what you said at the beginning. He's introducing this term. He's going to build on it a lot more later. Being in and being in the world are very special terms within Heidegger. I think it's going to I'm not sure I understand why you say that, Chase, because it says being in the world must be exhibited even more precisely with regard to knowing the world, and must be itself be made visible as an existential modality of being in. So being in the world must itself be made visible as an existential modality of being in. So being in the world then is a modality of being in, not the opposite component, being in being a component of being in the world.
Well, earlier in the text, he says this primary, this is on beginning of chapter 2. He says that we need a preliminary sketch of being in the world, and then he says
as an orientation of being in as such, because it's a being in is the broader concept. Being in the world is the narrower, I think, is the modality of it.
I guess
I guess
saying like being in the world is, the the entire thing he wants to examine, and then he's breaking it down into its parts and saying, so I guess I maybe saw it more the way Chase is reading it, but I'm not saying I'm right about that, but that is kind of how I was interpreting it.
Well, if you look at the beginning of chapter 2 again, on the Heidegger 53, which is also Stambaugh 53, at the very bottom, he says, so the compound expression being in the world indicates this unified phenomenon, but this does not prevent it from having a multiplicity of constitutive structural factors. And then he starts listing these structural factors, these component, what did he call them? Yeah, constitutive structural factors, which include in the world, being in. So those, I mean, it seems like he's just saying those are constitutive structural factors of being in the world.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Which, yeah, there's definitely a complex relation between those. But yeah, I think the way he's putting it, being in the world is the unified phenomena, the unified structure. Being in is one of the structural, what is it? Structural constitutive structural factor. Yeah, let's go with that. So
I think
yeah.
Macquarie says just constitutive items, right? Are we in the same area?
That's probably right. Although I don't know how I feel about the word item there, but yeah, I looked over, so I mainly been using the Stambaugh, but I looked over the Macri and Robinson one, and I have to say that one, there's places where the wording is very forced, I'll say that. And a lot of times those notes are helpful in the Macri and Robinson, but a lot of times if you read them, they're giving the reasons why their own translation is bad and doing it as a caveat, but you're like, well, why'd you use that then? They're like, but yeah. So item or what constitutive structural factor. It's a, yeah.
But and on 59 he says it is now to be recognized this is on the Stambaugh 59 first paragraph. I guess we can read the whole thing. Sorry. Both in Dasein and for it, this constitution of being in is always already somehow familiar. It is now to be recognized the explicit cognition that this task implies takes itself as knowing of the world, as the exemplary relation of the soul to the world, the cognition of the world, knowing or addressing oneself to the world and discussing it, logos, thus functions as the primary mode of being in the world, even though being in the world is not understood as such. Like he seems to be suggesting that there is a knowing, an active, possessive plural verb of knowing, and then he uses logos immediately after discussing, so that there's a linguistic factor to it, and that the being in is a component of being in the world, and that just the act of participation or modality of participating with it in this temporal aspect of our existence can be discussed, and in that discussing we can have a glimpse of the logos.
Um, on I'm following the German pagination, so it'd be page 53, but the second page in the text, so to speak, of 53, it in his discussion of what being in is number 3, it is true that being in the world is an a priori necessary constitution of Dasein, but is not at all sufficient to fully determine Dasein's being. If it's an a priori necessary, then doesn't that seem to say it's very important? Even if it's not sufficient to fully determine Dasein's being, if it's a priori necessary, it seems to me that that's you can't get around that.
But I mean, it could, yeah, a priori necessary, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is the main thing. I mean, so you could, so if being in the world is the fundamental, I don't know the right words to use, but if Dasein's fundamental mode of being is being in the world, and if being in the world has these, again, in the Stambach translation, multiplicity of constitutive structural factors, those structural factors could be a priori, even though they are constitutive of a more primary mode of being. So a priori doesn't, I don't think necessarily means it's the main, it is the, the fundamental. It just means it's something that is is prior to, it's not something you discover through experience. It's there prior. It's a constitutive component of it.
Sure, but the word after a priori is necessary.
Yeah, but it could still, again, it could be, I'm trying to think of a parallel example. You could have a complex definition of something. A human, I can't. A human is a rational animal, and that has two components, rational and animal. And the human is, what's primary is the rational animal. But you could still say that rational is a priori and necessary, and animal is a priori and necessary feature of the compound rational animal. So just because it's a priori and necessary doesn't necessarily mean it is the founding, the founding phenomena, it seems.
Another place to further complicate it, of course, is down at the bottom of bottom of the second full paragraph on 54 of the German. Being in is thus the formal existential expression of the being of Dasein, which has being in the world as its existential state. These are, I don't, he's not meaning for us to, I don't think, to at this point particularly try to parse out the fine details of what's meant here. I think we may be erring if we do that too much, an attempt to get exactly what he means at this point.
Yeah, because I think what he's trying to do in this chapter is get this distinction. I mean, he kind of was doing this in the last one as well. And in chapter 3, it's even more detailed about this, but the distinction between Dasein's kind of being, which is being in the world, and then this objective presence or present at hand, depending on which translation you have. And that is not Dasein's kind of being, although Dasein can, in some cases, in deficient modes, can be understood according to objective presence, but in a way that's kind of like it's alienation.
And it's largely not the kind of um of presence that he's caring about, that he's concerned with for anything, right? I mean, when he's talking about the table, he's trying to explain here the differences in these two things and show that, you've got the table up against the wall. This is about its againstness, not about its not about um
It's
physical
table.
locations.
Hmm. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
I
he's talking
thought
about an existential in versus a kind of objective spatial insideness.
Yeah, I thought that I was going to reference that same part. I thought that was really cool when he was talking about, at least in my translation, which was the Dombach or whatever. Like, he says, two things can press against each other or touch each other. He says, but like, don't mistake that for touching in the way Dasein does. That it doesn't have this capacity to, like if a table is touching a wall. And then even as I was reading, I was like, I wonder if he means like like the fact that if you zoom in, like there's always space. And he's like, and I don't mean that if you zoom in, there's always space. Like, I'm like, oh, okay, you called out my thought as I was having it. But at that point, I think he's trying to say that like, one like the table can't behold the wall. It can't. It's not in like in a relationship to it in the way Dawsines or humans are. It's like they're just two things pressing against each other. I thought that part was cool. That's all I'm
Yeah, it's like at the end of again, I guess I'm stuck on 59. I'm sorry if I'm not, but he says, for what is this is 59 Staumbaum middle paragraph, for what is more obvious than the fact that a subject is related to an object and the other way around. The subject-object relation must be presupposed, but this is a presupposition which, although it is inviolate in its own facility, is truly fatal, perhaps for that very reason. If its ontological necessity and especially its ontological meaning are left in obscurity, it's like he's saying that there's an aspect of phenomenology that's very, very important that we don't want to just toss the baby out with the bathwater, but there's also aspects of Dasein or human beings that when you talk about them in phenomenological senses, particularly in previous metaphysical traditions, get lost. And I think that's what he's warning about. Like we're trying to create a structure of knowing as we describe our experience of logos, so that we're not just boiling down Dasein into a metaphysical formula.
well, the bill and then people can correct me where I'm wrong in this, but like the way that this when Chase was bringing up the cogito earlier, I read Heidegger here as saying, like almost saying something like instead of I think therefore I am therefore I think, like that the knowing that part where he's talking about um the subject object divide and all of this, that like it's there's this primordial kind of being there, and then a way that takes you, like a way I can relate to the world, or a way Descartes for instance could relate to the world is as if he was a subject in relation to objects, and that's going to have a certain grammar to it that is going to like and logic to it and all that, that's going to take us away from getting in touch with just being, or in his whole project he's trying to set up here.
Yeah, the kind of explicit cognitive knowing that someone like Descartes would do in his meditations, he wants to say that, yeah, that is real in the sense that it is a way of being in the world. It's a way of, you know, interacting with the world, but it's only one kind of modality of such a thing. And even on top of that, it's a deficient modality. It's kind of, I would say, and he defines deficient as, I think, what maintains the possibilities of being at a minimum. So that's his, I think that's his definition of it. But and that's where the subject object thing will come. So what he's trying to say is that all these things are kind of already derivative of something that's more primary that is also, even though it is our primary way of being in the world, it doesn't get taken up into explicit conceptual logos. It's never has been given as a logos, and that's the job of phenomenology to do, is to give the logos for the phenomena. And that's what he's trying to do, I guess.
I thought this section was, we talked off and on about um, what a subject is for Heidegger and what its relation is to to the rest of his view. I thought this section was helpful in that regard because you could, you could really see him, like Chase was saying, trying to undercut the Cartesian notion that we are primarily a epistemological subject that then has to figure out, the way I put it when I'm talking to students, the fundamental question is, how do things out there get in here, right? How do things out there in the external world get into my personal consciousness? That's the way I think of Descartes' fundamental question. And I think it's interesting the way Heidegger tries to undercut that whole Cartesian assumption about, that's a derivative, like Chase was saying, that's a derivative mode that is derivative of a initial, more fundamental mode, which is already engaged in a world in which there already are things. It's like you don't have to worry about how things get out there or how things out there get in here, because we're already out there, or they're already in here, or however you want to put it.
Yeah, the section on, so it's on knowing, but where he's getting into the inside outside distinction, I thought that was very interesting. And so what he's saying there is something along the lines of the inside, the inner sphere of the knowing Cartesian subject. In order to make that distinction, for it to even appear as an inside of a knowing subject, that already requires a kind of ontological interpretation. But that ontological interpretation is obscured because it's just presupposed. And what he's saying is we need to actually look behind the curtain and examine that and see what are the conditions for being able to actually give a logos of something like that. Of, even though, yeah, it's so what he says some interesting things like the subject object relation is just as obvious in one sense as it is vacuous, which reminded me of my experience of reading Schopenhauer, at least the first book, where that's kind of what he starts with, is it's kind of like subject object relation. And on one level, yeah, you can see definitely why those occur together. But Heidegger would say, well, what is something that has to be going on first before we can even get to that distinction of subject object, inside, outside, because, these are roughly spatial terms of some type. Where are we getting this from? And that's what he's going to do and also at the same time say that there's this kind of existential spatiality of caring about things, more or less, that's what's primary, and then the kind of objective presence of spatial determinate spatial locations in relation to each other that, physics or kind of the most concrete kind of objective perception will give us, that those are derivative modes of a more primary way of being in the world that allows us to have something like experience of objects as mere presence. Yeah, so one thing he's going to say that I thought, at least in relation to, say, Descartes, that would help. So he's saying that there is no kind of primordial encapsulated inner sphere in which we're locked in, and then we then need to go find our way out of. Instead, the inner sphere or whatnot, the inside of Dasein is already outside. And that's what it really means to be in the world. That you don't have being in unless you also have kind of the other constitutive structural factors for it. So it needs to be in the world as well. And so one thing I was thinking with Descartes, so cogito ergo sum, in order for him to say that, he needs language, and you think of a kind of, there's no private language argument where, yeah, sure, it took a lot for Monsieur Descartes to be able to know that language. You need a world to have that language in order to even utter something like that. So I think that's just one example of the ways that, yeah, the inside is never fully locked in on itself, because how else could you even make that distinction unless you have something that's already infiltrating from the outside? So yeah, a relation with the outside and outsideness is that's what's important here. Basically, Heidegger's Nick Land.
Going off of what Chase was saying, there's a section on page 62 in the margin. This is just a phrase that I thought, or a sentence that I thought was pretty cool, and be ashamed to leave it out of this recording. It says, again, the perception of what is known does not take place as a return with one's booty to the cabinet of consciousness after one has gone out and grasped it. And this speaks closer to what Chase was saying, rather than perceiving, preserving, and retaining the Dasein that knows remains outside as Dasein, in mere knowledge about a context of the being of beings, in only representing it, in solely thinking about it. I am no less outside in the world together with beings than I am when I originally grasped them.
One way I think about Descartes is, Descartes imagines that he's this completely isolated thinking thing that is kind of floating in this non-material domain all by himself. But so, let's say if he is a mature ego, mature human ego, he assumes that somehow that's how he popped up in the world, like he was born, there's this body, and this completely mature human ego somehow gets attached to the body. And here I'm actually thinking of maybe Sartre more than Heidegger, but if you think about, like even I'm probably gonna say something stupid because I know almost nothing about childhood development. But if you think about the way, the child's ego develops, from what I understand, initially the child doesn't have a sharp ego. It's just there's just all this stuff happening. And then as the child interacts with parents and starts forming this distinction between oh, this is this and that's that, and they're not the same. And then as the child develops and grows, more and more of a sense of there is a distinction between me and my world. There's a distinction between me and other people. And then eventually what you hope is when the child develops into adolescence and adulthood, that then that ego finally does kind of mature and is able to separate itself from its, from its parents and these other factors, and become a really mature, relatively independent ego. But the point I'm making is that is way down. The notion of there being an independent ego, to the degree that there is, and I probably never really is, but the degree that there's an independent ego is actually something that happens later in life. It's not, it's not the way you don't just show up in the world with an independent ego. And so it's like Descartes is assuming that this fully mature, relatively independent ego is kind of the beginning state, completely failing to take into consideration that the very nature of that ego is from the very beginning defined by its relations to other people, by its connection to features of the world, by the way it distinguishes itself from other these features of the world. So the formation of the fully mature ego formed from this, this this social environmental nexus. And by the time it gets to the mature state, it's integrated a whole lot of that material into it. And so the idea that there ever is an isolated, independent Cartesian ego is an illusion. And so he seems to he seems to start there again, just not, I guess, not being aware that, well, how did you get there? Well, you got there from being already from the very beginning immersed in this huge, context, this social and environmental and world context. So that's why that means, like when Chase said, it's kind of like this Cartesian ego is derivative from this more primary engagement with the world. That's kind of the way I think, one way I think about it is he imagines that somehow this thing was just there to begin with, but it never was there just by itself to begin with.
Chase, did you said you think he defines deficient in a particular way. Do you know, is that in Being in Time? The Macquarie suggests that it's sort of defined in sections 26 and 27 in the Mitsein and empathy and the they self or das Man, but it doesn't give a fixed definition. There's a footnote on to page 20 or page 42 of the Macquarie, but it's a footnote by the translators that it tries to explain deficient modes, which says Heidegger likes to think of certain characteristics as occurring in various ways or modes, among which may include certain ways of not occurring, or occurring only in to an inadequate extent, or in general occurring deficiently. It is as if 0 and the negative integers were to be thought of as representing deficient modes of being a positive integer. I don't see anywhere in Being in Time, at least not from the index that I can find or anything I've read before, where he defines deficiency, other than to the extent he defines things at all. Really, a lot of times, defines it across chapters.
Yeah, so on 57 is the part I'm referring to. And
What
that's
does he say
57 in the Stamball and also the German.
Yeah, which paragraph? 57, the first one or the full paragraph?
I think based off of, I think that would be the first paragraph of it. I don't know. So
It's broken.
I feel like I'm somewhat okay. So I've been wanting to ask this question for a long time because the German, when people refer to it with the numbers, it's usually somewhat behind, where there's an ambiguity between what actually applies to the German pages. And
Oh no, the German. So like if you start with 57, and it's not going to break exactly in the beginning of a line, right? But 57, that page starts with the word besprechen split in two. So that's discussing, right? Besprechen, bestimmen, dot dot dot. So it's very close to but it's the only
okay,
difference
I see
from
exactly
that
what
to the
you're
German is
talking
that
about. Yeah.
the word discussing is split with half the word being on page 56 of the German.
Okay, so that's right where he's talking about the deficient modes too, right at the beginning of, I guess it would be 57. So he
Okay.
says the deficient modes of omitting, neglecting, renouncing, resting are also ways of taking care of something in which the possibilities of taking care are kept to a bare minimum.
Hmm.
So that's, yeah, he's definitely not saying this is a definition, but that's what I took it as. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, he's going to use this term a lot. Deficiency, or relate things to being deficient modes.
I mean, I
I
think
don't I don't know. Well, I don't know how accurate this is, but I'm kind of taking it to be as a like a disruption in like everydayness, or in like the taken for grantedness. So there's a disruption in that. That's the deficiency that can, and there needs to be a deficiency. I think he said that, right? Like there, there must be a deficiency um, of having to do with the world and taking care of it. So I think he thinks that the deficiency is necessary in order to uh, reconceptualize this everydayness and arrive at the existential structures.
yeah, I think the everydayness that he talks about, those are the deficient modes of things. And this is also by deficient and by this keeping possibilities to a bare minimum. That's also in line with what he talks about with inauthentic in oh God, I messed that up. Inauthentic. Um, there's something also in this reading where he kind of, they're not a definition, but he talks about he says something helpful in regard to authenticity and inauthenticity as a criterion. I think it's is that on the first page? Yeah. Oh no, that's a little different, but yep. Mindness belongs to existing Dasein as the condition of possibility of authenticity and inauthenticity. Dasein exists always in one of these modes, or else in the modal indifference to them. But yeah, so the everydayness is always going to be one of these deficient modes or inauthentic. So we're, in a way, you could, to simplify it somewhat, we're naturally inauthentic or in one of these deficient modes where our possibilities are kept to a bare minimum. I think the authenticity aspect will become more clear in the fourth chapter when he talks about the subject of Dasein and its everydayness, which would be Das Man, or the usually translated as the they self, is kind of the big other.
Which is a horrible translation of it. That's an absolutely horrible translation of Das Mann. It's it's Das Mann is like equivalent to en in French, right? One, but in the way that we don't use it in English um, very often, but it's very common in French and German.
Hmm. Yeah, because I think he's getting
Um,
at, it's so Das Man means the one, and he's getting at
it's
one
the one,
says
but it's the one
this.
in the
Yeah.
sense of it's the one, but it's the one in the sense of one does or one does not, right?
Mhm. Right.
So
Right.
putting that in a with an article in front of it is a Heideggerianism.
Yeah, yeah.
But Chase, you were what you were quoting? What page were you on?
Oh, that was the very first page of chapter 2, so
Oh, you went back to
53. Yeah,
okay.
that first paragraph there. And then the other one about the deficient modes, that was 57.
The in the margin 57.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also
But
it's also the Stambaugh 57.
right. Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Well, in this,
Yeah, I
forgive me.
agree. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
No, I don't have my headset on, so if I echo, I apologize. Because like this was something Nevin and I were discussing in chat. Because like, um, I the impression I get again from just a cursory reading with no background on Heidegger whatsoever is that he is not throwing phenomenology out the window. Like he thinks phenomenology has a use, but there is a limit from what would he like the aspect of what would be considered like Husserl phenomenology or Kantian or maybe even Kant and what I dubbed as the term as traditional phenomenology of his peers at the time. Like I think he's suggesting that 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 mode of thinking, when you treat being as an object, that language is inadequate for the expression of being. So he's not he's it's like he's trying to say that phenomenology has a role and you have to rely on it to express being, but the language used by my peers in a way limits the expression of being. So it's like he's trying to form an almost like a new phenomenology and a new expression of language
What
within this project.
can you explain what you mean by you're saying phenomenology, not phenomenology?
Phenomenology. I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong term.
Oh, because phenomenology was only, and the thing I think that's interesting is, Husserl went through phases in his own um phenomenology, and Heidegger was his student at a particular phase. Um, but um, I don't know that I don't know. I'll let Chase answer the rest. Chase has read a lot more Husserl than I have.
Not a great deal, and it was a while ago, but so Heidegger's definitely doing phenomenology and sees himself as doing that and thinks that, kind of his innovation is to say that doing phenomenology is also doing ontology, where Husserl would want to bracket out ontology. But they're definitely still I think there's more of a continuity between them than is usually taken to be. Especially so I know the Hubert Dreyfus, so he did a very popular commentary on Being in Time, and that's been I mean I read most of it, and I think it's pretty decent for certain sections, but he he gives the impression that Husserl is kind of doing something very naive, a kind of naive cognitivist kind of thing, and that Heidegger is doing something completely different, where I think really there's more continuity there because so Husserl, his phenomenological descriptions, he will definitely want to problematize a lot of the standard ways that's versus a kind of what he would call a naive natural attitude towards the world where that's where yeah I'm obviously a subject, of course there's objects in front of me, that's part of the real world, whatever, and that's the attitude that natural science will take as its starting point, where Husserl's phenomenology will want to bracket out a lot of those things and say, well, let's just pay attention to exactly what the phenomena, the things themselves are, and then see if we can find these certain kinds of essences within the phenomena. And I think that's what Heidegger's doing, except he's saying that the phenomena is ontological and existential, where Husserl would not want to quite make that leap. I'm not sure if that actually answered anything,
Well,
but
in
yeah.
a way too, the aspect of ontology, because it seems like maybe I'm saying like maybe we're saying the same thing, in that I feel like he's branching out phenomenology into a realm that has not been done previously.
Yeah, I think that's right.
What I'm leaning towards more so. And he's almost creating a new project, and he's trying to create a new language to express that without borrowing from previous traditions, so to speak.
Oh yeah, I think absolutely. But I think phenomenology was pretty new, right? It was Husserl was kind of the father of it. And,
Yeah. Although it's usually you can see where the basis of it was in Kant, but yeah, Husserl's definitely the main originator of it. And there's
I think,
phenomenalism, which is
And
something
forgive my
and this was
like,
his this was his
how is
differentiating himself from his mentor, right? For his because this was his dissertation, wasn't it? Basically, effectively.
and how is
being
he
in
different?
time or
It wasn't it like his or is it the way he got tenured? One of those two.
It
yeah,
was
I
where
think
he could get his philosophical chair appointment.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
because he didn't have enough publications or something. So that's why he scrambled to try and finish at least what was it, 2/3 of the first part or something. Apparently
Yeah.
that was good enough.
Well, he gave the page proof to some committee and they said, nice try, but we're still not interested. And it was only after it was published that they said, oh, yeah, you can come and teach here.
Trying to imagine what that committee was thinking. Like, okay, just imagine getting handed being in time as it is, as part of, and it's being like, nah, nice try, better luck next time. Yeah.
Well, if you're looking at it from a traditional philosophical point of view, it just sounds like nonsense.
Yeah, which I mean, I guess that's probably the opinion they took.
but he's pretty
Eventually
clear,
they
right? That
came to,
he's
I don't
trying to
know.
overthrow everything from everything from Socrates forward, right? And it's like kind of his yeah, these guys all got it wrong from the very beginning. Plato was
But that's
focusing on the wrong
also
things.
that's also probably a good way to piss off your committee, right? Is to say, everything you guys studied, it's all wrong. And I'm telling you, this is really what it is. I mean, that sounds like a formula for getting thrown out of the room.
He's a
Yeah,
Greek scholar
definitely.
though, and he was really he went into it deep in some of his other materials.
And forgive my ignorance, how is phenomenology starting with Husserl and not Hegel?
Oh, that
I'll just be as brief
yes,
as
please,
sorry, hold on.
please, Hunter.
Super briefly, sorry, I was just dealing with some other paperwork. That's what all the shouting was in the background. Don't worry about that. Basically, there's a super brief answer. I think that the meaning, the connotative meaning applied to the word phenomenology is very different. When it is employed by the Kantian and post-Kantian students of Middle Germany and like the German idealist gang in the early 19th century. I think that's one approach to phenomenology. And I think that it is very similar and very much, you're right, very much kind of like the root, in my view, sort of a root for other phenomenological traditions. Sorry, there's also some wildebeests in my living room that might be getting caught on the microphone. Excuse that. It's a lively house. What can you say? But the phenomenology that we see in people like Husserl, Jean-Paul Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, etc., etc. And the phenomenology that I think is the area of expertise of people like Hubert Dreyfus, who is the only reason that I was able to get through phenomenology of perception, because that guy's like a mega genius on that book, in my opinion, but I haven't read his other stuff. I think that that sort of phenomenology is characterized by a very different, a different set of precepts and of approaches that it is. Let's say this, just on a very surface level, it's like it's got a different guy is on the poster for the movie phenomenology. There's like a new thing. It's like we're not, yeah, we're doing phenomenology, yes, but the tagline is like we're gonna do this eidetic reduction thing now. That's phenomenology. That's the new hotness. This is what is it? Epistemic reduction or epoch, whatever. We're gonna do epochs and stuff. Fuck yeah, excuse me, F yeah. Like we're gonna and that sort of stuff is definitely phenomenology, and it's good. It's rigorous, but by the standards of, let's say, the phenomenology of 19th century German idealists, I think they would say it's something they don't recognize. I think that's what I would say. I think they would say it's something. Maybe I don't know if they would say it's good or bad, or a deviation or whatever, but it's something they don't recognize.
They say Husserl used to sit around and just like stare at his coffee and like think about the smells and then write about it for a long time, about the smells of his coffee and the drinking of his coffee, and talk about that. And that when Sartre and Beauvoir heard about this for the first time, they were sitting around, they're talking, they're saying, there's this philosophy out of Germany where people just sit around and think and talk about the drink that they're having. And they're sitting there having a drink. We could sit around and have a drink together and do philosophy, and that would be philosophy. We don't have to do all this Kant and Hegel crap, right?
I think Heidegger would hear that story about Sartre and his drink and be like, damn French people.
But apparently there was really, more Husserlian. The thing was that they heard about Husserl, but then it turned out that Sartre ended up being in prison and reading Sein und Zeit, and that's what he brought back for a text for this.
And it isn't he kind of following in that tradition then? So if you have the traditional Kantian Hegelian phenomenology, and then you have this move to eidetic reduction, particularly with epistemic reduction, and you have Heidegger coming in and saying, I want to take this a step further by shifting.
What do you mean by, I don't know what you mean by eidetic reduction. I'm not sure that means anything to me.
It's that thing. That's not
the epoche.
It's the thing. It's that thing that Husserl did all the time. Eidetic. What's the word? Are we saying?
Yeah,
eidetic reduction, but it's the epoche, right?
Yes.
I know what you're talking about, Joseph, because I think maybe we both say it stupid, because I don't know Greek.
I mispronounce words all the time, so please let me know. Like I said,
I don't know.
I think that's
right. Well, it was confusing me partly because you
know.
keep saying phenomenology, and I'm not trying to criticize your pronunciation.
No, please,
I'm not.
let me know.
Well, I'm trying to criticize it, but not criticize
right
it for like Well, the problem is because you're using the word like noumena in the word, right? So it's like really throwing me off. I'm like, phenomenology is what it's turning into for me, and it's really because it's about phenomena, right? Which is really really important.
No,
it's all
please,
about
let me know.
phenomena.
Phenomenology. I will do my best, and it will not be the last time you say this. So
Yeah, it's no problem. I just want to make sure. I don't think we're talking about
Something
Hegel at all. And I think Heidegger mentions Hegel once in this book. May not even be in this book. He hasn't mentioned him much at all.
Hegel? Wait, no, Hegel's he's a big part of the second part, or the very last part.
In the time stuff, in the history. Yeah, but he doesn't, even there, he doesn't say much about him, does he?
I think he has a whole section on him at the very end.
Oh, does he? Oh. Let's go back and see what he says. But anyway.
May I ask a question of, it's at the bottom of page 62, and it's page 62, whatever you're reading. It's at the very bottom, the last two sentences. Knowing is a mode. I'm using the Schmidt, whatever. Knowing is a mode of Dasein, which is founded in being in the world. Thus, being in the world as a fundamental constitution requires a prior interpretation. So being in the world. So interpretation precedes being in the world, and who's doing the interpretation?
So the interpretation, I think that's actually part of being in the world, or it's one of the constitutive structural factors.
I think he's saying it must be interpreted before knowing. So
Yes,
I think this
right.
this is one of those places where it connects to Zen, right? I mean, this is like, what was your original face right before you were born? It's trying to understand this before knowing.
Yeah, because he talks about understanding as a existential, and that's going to involve interpretation. So interpretation is an ontological thing that we do where knowledge is something that is, it doesn't say ontic
But
necessarily,
it relates to the ontic. We know things
Yeah.
ontically, right? We know things ontically. This is an ontological experience. This is it's we have to existentially relate to this, because if we try to do it through knowing, we're just going to get led astray. It's going to be, and I think this is kind of what he's going to get into with tool being and that sort of thing as we go along.
Yeah. So the interpretation is ontological, and that's what we would do in order to get the ontic character of beings as a mode of knowing, or how things come to appear as objects that are known by a knowing subject. That requires a certain interpretation. Yeah, hopefully that somewhat clarifies it.
Is he, by saying it that way, Chase, are you interpreting to say that he's questioning, he's trying to go before subject object?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's one so in the Stambot, it has his Heidegger's marginal notes. And one thing I thought was kind of funny. So on 60, both in the Stambot and in the German, at the very end of that paragraph there, he says in the text, but subject and object are not the same as Dasein and world. And then in his marginal notes made later, he says, certainly not, so little that even putting them together in order to reject this is already fatal.
Right.
So quite strong words there.
I kind of liked his little section there where he's like, you can't go into this cabinet and grab it and there it is, you know, like that was well said. I think was that on 60 in Standball where he says where does he say this?
I think that's at the very end at
It's at the very bottom of page 60 and right above the beginning of 61 on page 60, if that makes sense, of the Schmidt. Of course, one is sometimes assured that the subject's inside in its inner sphere is certainly not to be thought of as a kind of box or cabinet. but what the positive meaning is of the inside of immanence, in which is knowing, excuse me, which in which knowing is initially enclosed, and how the character of being of this being inside of knowing is founded in the kind of being of the subject. About this there is silence.
I rather enjoyed that part.
I'm not I don't know, frankly, that much about current philosophy of mind, but it seems to me that a lot of philosophy of mind is still in this kind of mode because, again, the question is, how do things out there get in here, right? So, I actually just went through this thing with my students as a preparation for Descartes. So I'm going full in Cartesian dualism, in my classes, and just to, so that they have a sense of what he's saying. But so what I start off with is say, well, let's forget about Descartes for, before we start. And I give them, what I claim is sort of a contemporary view. I'd rather, I'm experimenting on the students, but but so what I tell them is, so what happens when I'm experiencing this water bottle according to a contemporary view? Well, according to a contemporary view, I have nerves that collect pressure and temperature data and convert that data into electrochemical signals that travel along nerves. My eyes collect, color and intensity and other or visual information and convert that into data. And so what the brain gets is just a bunch of data. And so, because I keep telling them, I say, this is not a bottle. Speaking about the contemporary theory, I'm not sure Heidegger would say that, but, for contemporary philosophy, this is not a bottle. This is an idea in my mind. It's not a bottle. I mean, the bottle's not in my brain, right? It's just not. And on this contemporary view, somehow all this electrochemical data goes into the brain, and then the brain somehow manufactures consciousness. And what is that? Well, nobody really knows. And people are still arguing about, different philosophers of mind argue about, well, what is that consciousness? Is it a brain state? Is it an epiphenomenon? What is it? But then what I'm trying to point out to them, according to this contemporary theory, which is not far from Descartes, you have literally absolutely zero direct access to the world. Zero direct access. It's all mediated by data processing, electrochemical signals going into the brain, and then the brain somehow manufactures consciousness. And so there's this radical rift between the mind in here and the world out there, this hard, and it's an impossible gap to bridge. And the only difference between that contemporary model, near as I can tell, and Descartes is Descartes says, well, that consciousness is not generated by the brain. It's its own thing. Other than that, it's pretty much Cartesianism. And in one of the articles we read in the 19th century class, this guy, Alan Wood, which some of you know, he's written a lot of interesting stuff. His comment is, we are all recovering Cartesians because of this pervasive model that consciousness and world are radically different kinds of things. And so how in the world do you get physical stuff into the mental world? And that's so again, I think Alan Wood's right. We are still today, it seems to be, a lot of philosophy of mind is stuck in this Cartesian dualism, and nobody knows really what is consciousness. Is it an epiphenomena? Is it a brain state? And how is it that that physical object out there in the world turns into this image in my mind? So I think it's all that Heidegger is trying to undercut, is that, which again, I still think is very pervasive today. And there was, my very inexpert survey in philosophy of mind, people still think in those terms of this radical rift between mind and world. And, and that's the subject object chasm that that people have trouble bridging. Kant has an interesting solution to that problem, but it requires the positing of transcendental structures. I'm thinking, and I don't know, maybe Eric or Deirdre or Chase could tell me, but it seems to me that Heidegger is trying to give an account of phenomena that doesn't require transcendental structures, that doesn't, require that kind of move that Kant made, but still nevertheless overcoming this radical fracture between mind and world and saying there isn't a radical fracture there because we already started in the world from the very beginning. I'm looking at Deirdre and Chase, they're like, no.
I don't
So
know. I think I kind of maybe started to lose you a little bit on some of that towards the end where you were going. I know earlier on I was thinking about how you were saying it, and when you were talking about your water bottle, and I wasn't sure which way you were going to go, and then I kind of lost whether you went either way. It seemed like maybe you went neither way, but I'm not sure. But
I was trying to describe the Cartesian view that Heidegger is trying to overcome.
Right, but I know you talked about two different thoughts. I thought on how it is, and I think for Heidegger, as I think we'll get in particularly in the upcoming chapters with the tools, it's it's more about the phenomenological relationship that occurs when you reach over and take a drink of water and don't even know you've done it. That, or, like that if I'm thinking about picking up this glass, that's not what we're talking about here. That's knowing, right? If I just reach over and take a drink, that's what we're interested in here. And I looked at the German for the last paragraph there of the chapter 13, and my German isn't great, but it is worded a bit different. I don't know how did you say it was, that last two sentences in the Standba? In the Macquarie, it says, knowing is a mode of Dasein founded upon being in the world. Thus, being in the world as a basic state must be interpreted beforehand. And I think the German is maybe a little more clear about what he's getting at in that, even in my poor interpretation of it, because it's like knowledge is, he of course creates weird structures if you try to translate it word for word, but it's kind of like knowledge is the in the world sign, in the Welt sign, and that's it says knowledge is a, I guess it is, knowledge is a in the Welt sign is a I think what you're saying here is knowledge is a within in the Welt sign is a profound or fundamental, fundierte is the word, modus des Dasein, so a fundamental or profound mode of Dasein. Therefore, it requires that in the world, that in I keep wanting to say like half in English and half in German, in the Welt sein, in the world, being in the world, as a starting point, as a constitutionally requires vorgängige Interpretation. So it requires prior interpretation, prior to that knowledge. And it's not really coming across with my horrible pronunciation. It's now going to be on YouTube forever. but it's when you read it in the German, it kind of fits together better, that it's saying to understand this, it's knowledge is like fundamentally part of this as a mode of Dasein. And so we have to get before that, because we're not going to be able to really get at it at the ground of it through knowledge. It's like we're trying to see it's like trying to see your own eyes, right? Without a mirror.
Yeah.
So poor performance on me here, coming in at the very end of the meeting, like 15 minutes left, and being like, "Hey, so where actually are we in the book?" Um, but did we get to the section on the worldhood of the worldhooding, like
No,
page 91 forward?
we haven't talked about it anyway. Is that part of our reading tonight?
We did section 14, so the first section of that chapter 3, but where it's just kind of introducing. Yeah,
Yeah,
well, that's
We
the
haven't
title
started.
of the.
We
I
haven't even started
apologize.
really talking about that yet, have we?
No, I apologize for the weirdness of that. It was again just one of those break the pages up kind of things. So yeah.
Well, that one didn't seem, because I think there's a decent amount of continuity between chapter 2 and chapter 3, so it was understandable.
Oh, and 15 is a like a standard starting place for a lot of readings in
Right.
classes, right? So people don't often start with 15 or with like 12 and then 15.
That's what we did in Alistair's 19th,
Yeah,
or not 19th, that the
contemporary
Continental.
continental.
Yeah. He started with 15 and then went to what, like 20 or 19 or so. The stuff
Yeah,
about
I think we read a
sign.
section like we read like 8 or 12 first, I think, but then we went to 15 and we skipped over to and started and went to 15 and then yeah, read up through the tools section and that's all. And then the references and signs.
I remember what we didn't read was the stuff later that he gives specifically about Descartes. So he's gonna,
Yeah, 19. We didn't read that, I don't think, in this
yeah,
class.
yeah. So we did 15 to 18, I think, for at least chapter 3, and then 19 through 20 or so, he'll distinguish his view of the world versus Descartes' view of the world. And then he gives some, I think there's 3 sections on existential spatiality where he's still distinguishing it from Cartesian extended space and objective presence and whatnot. And then in chapter 4, we get the being with others, where we get the whole Das Man thing and whatnot. And that was the one where I thought those sections need to be read together.
Oh, yeah,
Luckily, it wasn't
absolutely.
too hard to
Yeah.
figure it out with the schedule.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
25, 26, 27 need to be read together, right? Yeah, for sure. Maybe I'm not sure
yeah,
beyond that.
I'm happy. Yeah, that makes sense to me. So Tristan, did you want to say something about that section 14, the worldliness stuff?
Well, I just want, me, I like to play jazz when do these discussions, you know what I mean? So if we got to it and we were, riffing, like, we could riff on into it, that'd be good. But, we don't have a lot of time left, and, it's not a lot if we want to just in the next meeting, just like kind of start from there. Because I don't know, like there's lists. My brain also was like, please, Lord, save me. Like, I'm doing a lot of like legal writing right now, on top of doing the reading, and it's utility legal writing. So it's like, let's put on the most boring aspects of the law on top of it. So I wouldn't mind coming back to it next week. That's essentially, I brought it up to ask, can we please talk about it next week? Because I didn't really have anything big, and that's to say, mainly because my brain wasn't able to form anything like as a coherent question. I am not a pre-lawyer. I'm a lowly scrivener, and I submit all of my work with submission.
So you prefer to?
I abstain from answering. I prefer not to answer.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's a good answer. Yeah. I also prefer not to.
What is happening to our world? Deirdre's a liar. Tristan may be a liar, maybe be a liar someday. Hunter may be a liar
Scrivener.
someday. Oh my God.
I want Hunter to represent me personally. Sorry, Deirdre.
I would do the OJ defense.
I need to get Hunter like
I think it depends on the
zoot
crime.
suit.
Yeah.
Like a
Yeah,
big
that's
zoot
true.
suit
Yeah,
with like
definitely depends on the
multicolored
crime.
shoes. I think Hunter would rock one of those.
Sorry, I didn't hear it. I talked over it. I'm sorry. What'd you say?
I was saying that we need to get Hunter a zoot suit, like big pinstripes, like big billowy, like jacket and pants, and then multicolored like shoes. You know what? Even if I did go to prison, I wouldn't be mad.
Yeah, with his beautiful full hairline too. Yeah.
We're all jealous of. I am, at least. I'm balding it. You can't see it, but there's a big spot up there.
I just gave up.
You know that full head of hair was seen as an important feature among Roman orators. So I just want to let you know that it's since time immemorial, folks. You know, the hierarchy.
For Greek orators.
Listen, your effeminate Asiatic Greeks can take your beards and your earrings and your.
So Hunter, you're saying that's why Socrates was found guilty because he didn't have a full head of hair?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to say that it was the reason, but you know,
A
I'm not going to
reason?
say that it wasn't irrelevant.
I mean, he wanted to die anyways, so good riddance.
I would too if I was that bald. Okay, that's enough. Sorry, that's the last thing I'm saying.
I thought the issue was that he did. I thought the issue was whether or not he had a beard. I thought there was a question of whether he had a beard.
Yeah, but I like the interpretation that Socrates possibly wanted to just like die because he was bald or something.
All right. I think that's a good one to end on. I'm gonna head out. So this was great. Thank you all.
Yeah,
I
likewise.
appreciate the conversation. And again, please keep me honest when it comes to using the right terms, or send me a message or whatever. For me, it's just practice and repetition, because I'll continue to get it wrong. But this has been a great discussion.
So we just have a few minutes. Does anyone have any final question, comment, or should we just end on that and where we are?
If we can drop a note in Discord to pick up on the section that Tristan was saying, just because I know I'll forget, that would be helpful. I'm saying it out loud now so I don't forget, and I'll do that as well. But I think unless anybody else has anything else, it might be a good ending place.
And how far are you wanting to read from there? What is our schedule?
So
go ahead.
I think it's the next schedule is 15 to 17. Is that right?
Yeah.
So, and then,
yeah.
So we would just include 14 in that, which theoretically we should have already read.
That's an odd break, isn't it? Wouldn't it be better to break before 17 or after 18? 17 and 18 gotta go together, don't they?
Yeah, but after looking at it for a while, 17 works the best to try to basically, that's the way to get chapter 4 to go together, is because you're right. 17 and 18 do go together, but that both those sections are really long, or pretty long, and for that reason it at least it looked to me like 15 to 17 was a good idea.
And part of the problem is, again, the distribution of pages per week. So I'm guessing that's part of what Chase was trying to do, is also, not have like a ton of pages one week and like 3 pages the next week or something.
Oh, did you want to stop the recording? We're doing admin stuff.
That's probably a good idea.
That's why I was asking.